In this video, I'm going to share more than 20 Lightroom tips, tricks, and shortcuts that I use daily when editing in Lightroom. I'll take you from beginning to end as I edit this photo. The first thing I like to do before editing is to create a direction for my edit. In this photo of a northern cardinal, there's a feeder in the back. This part of the branch has a straight edge to it. This part is just distracting and the tail is cut off. And because of all of that, I think my only option here is to do a heavier crop and create a close bird portrait. Next thing to do is to identify what the focal point of the image is. This cardinal has a beautifully raised crest that was chasing a female, and right when it landed it had the crest perfectly up, and it's being illuminated by the light in the background, so I really want to bring more attention to that. I think that's one of the elements in this image that make it a good portrait. And I also want to bring out the greens in the background because they're looking a little bit flat. I always start by removing chromatic aberration and enabling lens corrections. Checking these two boxes helps correct green or purple chromatic aberration, lens distortion, and vignetting if your lens has it. Next, I'll click on the crop tool and adjust my aspect for the right medium. In this case, I want this photo to go to Instagram, so I'm going to use a 4:5 crop, but I can adjust this if I wanted to print this photo or if I wanted to use it for something else. While cropping, I'll hit O on the keyboard to adjust my grid overlay to see which composition works best. Depending where my subject is in the frame, I can also hit Shift and O to change the orientation of this overlay. Before beginning the edit, I always hit J on the keyboard, which will show shadow and highlight clipping in blue and red respectively. Let's start up here with the basic tab. Every adjustment under this basic tab is a global adjustment, meaning it affects the entire image. For example, if I wanted to raise the shadows in the eye of the cardinal since it's a little bit dark, I'd also be raising the shadows in the feathers, making them appear more washed out. That's why I try to minimize the amount of editing I do in this tab and focus more on precisely editing the parts of the photo that I actually need to adjust using filters and brushes and all of these other tabs below. So in the basic tab, I'll just do minor adjustments that I feel the entire image needs. Throughout the editing process, I like to hit L on the keyboard, once to isolate the image against a semi-transparent background, and twice to isolate it against a completely black background. And while I'm in this view, I can also hit backslash to toggle between my before and after, and this just helps me reassure that I haven't pushed an edit too far and that my edit is actually going in the direction I want it to go in. If I'm planning to add a white border to the image for social media or for printing, I can also right-click on the background and adjust the color to see how that image will look against a white backdrop while I edit. Moving out of the basic tab, the next thing I want to address in this image is the colors. The cardinal is looking a little orange instead of red, and that background isn't really showing off those greens. So what I need is the HSL tab, which stands for Hue, Saturation, and Luminance. Hue represents the colors in our images, saturation is the intensity of those colors, and luminance is the brightness of those colors. Since I want to push this orange towards a red, I'll click on the hue slider, but instead of just pushing sliders around and trying to figure it out, I'll actually select this target adjustment and click on the color I want to adjust. Then by simply dragging up or down, it's going to adjust those colors accordingly. Notice on the right side how the sliders move side to side as I bring the cursor up and down. So I just want to subtly move these oranges towards the red, not really doing it too much. I just want to bring the colors back to what they actually were. And I want to do the same for the background because the background of this cardinal was my green birch tree, and that green really isn't coming through in the image. Now I'll head into the saturation tab to adjust the intensity of the reds and the greens that we just brought out. Under the luminance tab, I want to darken the reds because they're looking a little bright. And again, if we isolate our image with L and using the backslash for the before and after, I think we're starting to get to a pretty good point in our image. Moving down the list, the next thing I want to adjust is the detail, and if sharpening and noise is usually an issue for you, I'd probably suggest looking into the third-party plugins, Topaz Denoise and Topaz Sharpen, which I'll link below, but for this video, I'll use the sharpening tool inside of Lightroom. I usually like to bring the sharpening between 30 and 50, not too high, just to give a little bit of sharpening to the image, and I also changed the radius to 1.2. Right now the sharpening is affecting the entire image, but what I can do is come down to masking and hold down Alter option and drag along the slider. Everything in white is what's actually being sharpened, so I can just push this masking all the way to the right side until all the noise around the cardinal disappears and only the cardinal is in white, which means none of the noise is actually being sharpened. I find a bit of noise being in there is okay because you'll also select more of the cardinal, so I'll push it a little bit backwards. But that's perfect, and now the sharpening is more or less only affecting the cardinal. Now that I'm done with most of the main tabs, it's time to really clean up the image and bring focus to the focal point of the image, which to me is the crest of the northern cardinal getting illuminated by that backlight. First thing I want to do is remove this small distracting branch that's just poking out from the bottom over here. You know, it's totally up to you if you want to remove things or not from your images. You know, this is one of the times where I use the clone tool a lot, is when I do a crop and there's still a bit of a leaf or a bit of a branch that's just poking into the frame. It just looks weird. It doesn't have a place in the photo, and you know, removing it I don't think really detracts from reality, so I'm totally fine with doing this. But yeah, it's a personal preference, and usually I'd be more precise with this, but for the sake of the video I'll just go through it quickly and patch this up. Another thing I want to mention while I'm under the spot removal tool is I'll usually come down and I'll select visualize spots. And this is a great way to check if your images have any dust spots that might be a little bit difficult to see otherwise. So it'll kind of do similar to that masking and the sharpening. It'll just turn everything white and you'll kind of see there's some noise here and the cardinal selected, but there's no real obvious dust spots. So I think we're good for this image and I won't have to do anything. But if you have a camera that suffers from dust spots quite a bit, this is a great tool to be able to pinpoint them and remove them. The final steps for this image is to use the graduated filter, radial filter, and adjustment brush to zero in on certain parts of the image and do localized edits to really make it stand out. I'll start with the adjustment brush, and there's only 4 small things I want to address with this brush. The most important thing to do though when you're using this tool is you want to have auto mask selected. And this is what it looks like when you have auto mask off, and this is what it looks like when you have auto mask on. So it makes a big difference when I'm trying to do localized edits on the bird and I don't want anything to bleed off into the background. The first brush adjustment that I want to do is select the entire bird and then remove a little bit of that warmth, shift it more towards blue because it is looking a little bit orange to me still. And I'll also add some exposure, some contrast, and some clarity to just really make the bird pop. Next, there's this small bright patch at the bottom that my eye is slightly being drawn to, so I'll just darken that up. I'll also darken and remove some saturation from the black feathers since they're looking a little bit washed out. And lastly, I'll increase the exposure and contrast in the eyes to make them a little bit livelier. Here's the before and after with the brush adjustments. It's not a huge difference, but it just makes the cardinal stand out a little bit more. The next thing I want to do is I want to bring focus to the top of that image where that light's coming down. A great way to do that is with a vignette, but I don't want to use just a regular vignette that goes evenly around the entire image. So instead I'll just create my own vignette using the radial filter. And I'm just bringing down the exposure, the highlights, and the shadows and trying to position the filter so it's not affecting the bright spot in the top left or the head of the cardinal. And if I hover over the point created by the filter, a mask is going to appear showing me which part of the image is actually being affected by this filter. The last thing I want to do is enhance the light coming from behind the cardinal using a graduated filter. I'm using some exposure, warmth, and magenta so the light isn't too green, and I'm also adjusting the dehaze so the filter is a little bit softer. And by dragging this end of the filter, I'm able to feather it more and create a softer gradient. So here's the original image. Next to it, I did an edit using just the basic adjustments tab and nothing else. And then lastly, the final edit we just did. I think there's a huge difference between the three. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, leave them down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy birding.